Hi, welcome to episode 10 of Exploring Gnosticism. We are really coming to the end of our series here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the Gospel of Judas before doing so. The Gospel of Judas is part of 4 documents that were discovered called the Tachos Codex, Tchacos, the Tachos Codex. It's a papyrus of codexes that were discovered in Egypt in 1978, so this makes them the most recent of the Gnostic writings to have been discovered. As we've seen, most of the ones we've looked at came from either 1896 or 1948. This one was rediscovered only in 1978, and it's had a pretty interesting history since then. We found that the Gospel of Judas was originally written in the Greek language in the year 150, and it's mentioned in 180 by Irenaeus in his work against heresies. We talked about how a lot of the Gnostic writings that we've looked at, the only thing we knew about them down through the centuries until this rediscovery was what was written about them by their opponents. And so we knew that the Gospel of Judas existed because in 180 Irenaeus does mention it and talk against it in this work against heresies. But this version that we have is not, of course, that original. It is one of the Coptic writings, probably from around the mid-4th century AD. Now, after the document was hidden from heresy hunters, it remained undisturbed until its discovery in 1978. When it was discovered, though, nobody really understood it. Nobody knew what it was, or its significance, or its importance, and so it became the property of antique dealers. Now, these antique dealers knew the age of it, and they knew that it was stolen at one point because of that, back in 1982. They tried to sell it, but the purchase price couldn't be met. The museums who were looking into acquiring it, the highest bid they could offer was $50,000. These antique dealers had a reserve price of $3 million listed on it, so they were unable to sell it. It was badly handled. It deteriorated very noticeably over these few years. And then from 1983 to 2000, it was kept in a bank vault where it was exposed to the elements, and so a lot more deterioration, a lot more damage came to it from that. In 2000, it was finally sold to an antiquarian, and in his attempt to preserve it, he froze it. Well, that destroyed it even further and made it incredibly fragile for when people actually did get the chance to grab hold of it and start to study it. In 2001, scholars finally got their first real look at it and discovered what the document was. Plans were made for the preservation, the translation, and the publication of this work, and a lot of that process took place locally at Kent State University's main campus in 2004. Finally, in April of 2006, the Gospel of Judas is going to be published with huge media attention that still continues to receive new reviews, new books, even to this day, 15 some odd years down the road. So, what is this Gospel of Judas? What is it that it reveals? Well, unlike the Valentinian text that we've been looking at, the Gospel of Judas is part of what's called the Sethian tradition. If you remember biblically, Seth was the 3rd son of Adam and Eve, who represented a new beginning for humanity after the world's first murder. To be from the generation of Seth, therefore, is to be part of this new enlightened humanity. After the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve do produce these 3 offspring. And the first 2, right, one kills the other is doomed and cursed. And so it is Seth who is actually going to carry on the tradition, the lineage of humanity. Some of the Sethian texts that we have, we've already mentioned the Apocryphon of John. That one is a Sethian text. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, the 3 Steles of Seth, Zoroastrianos, and Alogene. All of those fall under what we call the Sethian tradition. Now, within these texts, they produce a different view of the pleroma, slightly different from what we talked about previously. You remember a few weeks ago we spent a whole episode dealing with the idea of the pleroma as that original fullness from which everything came. Well, in essence, I've got a board here, and we'll put this up and see. See the images that are presented to us here. As we go through and explain it, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So, originally there was this one transcendent, unknown, and unknowable divine being, which we call the pleroma. It was exclusively spirit. Now, within eternity, this pleroma, of course, stretches out throughout all eternity. There is, there is no separation or distinction. The pleroma is a completeness, a fullness. But in this eternity, this being began to generate other divine beings as personifications of his own characteristics. And so you may want to think about the avatars within the Vedic cultures. And so remember how, there it is, remember how Vishnu is the supreme deity, the fullness, the completeness from which all other things are derived. And so, Vishnu produces the avatar, the first created being, which is Brahma, and Brahma is responsible for the creation of the universe. So there is a secondary entity who is responsible for creating the universe rather than the one true God himself. And that's the same basic idea that you're finding here within the Gnostic tradition. So within this eternity, the being generated these other divine beings as personifications or avatars of his own characteristics, his own being. So being was eternal. So eternalness came into being in its own divine entity. It thought, and so thought came into existence as a separate entity. It was light, and so light came into being, and so on and so forth. Now, some of these divine beings generated other divine beings until the heavenly realm was filled up with these beings. And so the pleroma, the fullness of existence, was full of these eons, as they were called. And together, these eons make up the pleroma. They are the fullness. Now, all of this that we're talking about now took place before the act of creation of the universe. But one of these eons left the divine realm and created a different type of divine being, one that was generated outside of the pleroma. And this is what is known as Yaldabaoth, or Yahweh. Yaldabaoth declares, I am God, and there are no others. Now, Yahweh did not know the pleroma because he was created outside of it. As we've seen, that which is imperfect cannot know that which is perfect. Aristotle explained that to us. But Yahweh, since he was created outside of it, he was not directly, he came from the pleroma, but he wasn't directly knowable of it because he was a outside being, a separate being. Much like Brahma was a created being of Vishnu, Yaldabaoth was a created being of the pleroma. Now, the fallen eon that came from this was Sophia. Sophia is wisdom, is knowledge. The material world was created, right? So Yahweh created these other imperfect beings, and they are responsible for making the world into what we know it to be. So that fallen eon of Sophia, or wisdom, comes into being, and the material world then becomes a prison for Sophia. And human bodies were created to house the divine spark of Sophia. So think about how this is influenced very heavily by Plato's concept of being and becoming, right? How everything exists in that perfect, absolute, unchanging, unyielding realm of being. But then, when we are born into this world, we forget all of that. We lose our connection or our knowledge of that perfection. And we exist in this realm of becoming, this imperfect and changing world. And that's what's happening here in this Sethian tradition of Gnosticism, is that as Yaldabaoth comes into being, he is stepping outside of the pleroma, and he creates these beings that are created outside of the pleroma, and therefore they are imperfect and have no direct connection. But, just like Plato had said, even though we forget this knowledge that comes to us, or this knowledge that we had in that other realm, we can still try to strive for it, and eventually we can go back to it. And that's really the message here within the Gnostic tradition too, is that we can get back to what we came from. So the material world is this prison, just like the realm of being is described as that prison of the cave in Plato's allegory. And human bodies are there to house that divine spark of Sophia. And so within our bodies, within our minds, we have that sense of knowledge is there, but it has to be revealed. It has to be given a shock so that we can come back to what it's supposed to be. Now, this is the reason for suffering. It's the reason for reason. Our world is not created by the true God. Our goal of salvation, then, is to allow the divine spark of Sophia, scattered in all of these human forms, to escape from the world and be reunited and return to that pleroma. And this, and this can only happen when we learn the truth about ourselves. So again, just like Plato had taught us, we need to know ourselves. Right? Socrates says, know thyself. So we need to come to know the real truth of ourselves. We need to reveal that knowledge. Again, in the Eastern traditions, it's the same idea. We see that in the Bhagavad Gita. Right? Arjuna has forgotten his true nature. He's forgotten himself. He needs to rediscover that truth. And so that's what we're looking for in this world. We have forgotten our true nature. We've forgotten where we've come from. And we need that spark of Sophia. We need that knowledge, that wisdom. We need Gnosis to get it back. So our goal of salvation is to allow the divine spark of Sophia that's scattered in all of these human forms to escape from the world and be reunited and return to that pleroma. And this can only happen when we learn the truth about ourselves. Saving knowledge is self-knowledge, but this knowledge cannot come to us in human terms. It can only come from the pleroma, when a divine eon comes to this realm to tell us. And so in the Sethian tradition, Jesus is that figure who is going to come to reveal this knowledge to us. And we're told that Jesus comes from the eon of Barbelo, which means that the divine is sent to reveal the truth. Jesus comes from the eon of Barbelo, from the pleroma, so he possesses that knowledge. And he is the one who will reveal this knowledge to us. And so that is his function, that is his purpose. And so once Jesus has come, he has revealed the truth to us, we can accept that truth and find our way back to the pleroma from which we came. And that is sort of the metaphysics behind the Sethian tradition of Gnosticism. So with that, we'll go ahead and take a look right directly into the Gospel of Judas itself. Now, I will say that the tradition that we're looking at here is a very interesting one. But the Gospel of Judas itself, while it is important, is not as interesting or as exciting as some of the other texts within this tradition. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and start off at the beginning of the Gospel of Judas. One day he was with his disciples in Judea, and he found them gathered together and seated in pious observance. When he approached his disciples, gathered together and seated and offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, he laughed. The disciples said to him, "Master, why are you laughing at our prayer of thanksgiving? We have done what is right." He answered them and said to them, "I am not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised. So, the disciples here see themselves as pious beings. They're following the religious discussion, but Jesus is laughing at them. Why? Well, some commentators, such as Elaine Pagels, find that this Jesus is kind of a cruel individual. He's mean-spirited, he's filled with anger, and that's why he's laughing at them and mocking them. But actually, I prefer to see this in the vein of the laughing Buddha. Jesus is not a mean individual. He is not cruel in any way. But like the laughing Buddha, he is going to mock an individual in a way for their own good. It's a humorous form of getting people to do what is right. So how can one person be so sure of something that is so unsure? That's the humorous part. That's the laughable aspect. How can we know without gnosis? These individuals, like so many people who find themselves in the realm of religion and faith, become very puffed up in their approach to the world. They think, I've got all the answers, I know everything there is to know. And so they're very serene within their approach. They're very serious in the way they go about doing things. But when it comes right down to it, how can we really know until we've received that gnosis? We can't. So what Jesus is saying here is that the disciples are acting in a way to appease the wrong God. They are objectifying the demiurge rather than the true God, that being that was born outside of the pleroma, rather than the one God of the pleroma. And that's the point. Individuals who are not initiated into this understanding of what we just went through on the board don't understand that the true God is not the one who created the universe. The universe was created by a created being. And so it is an imperfect world because it was created by an imperfect being. The real God, the one we are trying to get back to, that's the being that we should be offering praise to. That's the being we should be worshiping. But we're not. And that's what he's laughing at. When Jesus observed their lack of understanding, he said to them, "Why has this agitation led you to anger? Your God, who is within you," and again, something's missing here, "have provoked you to anger within your souls. Let any one of you who is strong enough, strong human being, bring out the perfect human and stand before my face." They all said, "We have the strength." But their spirits did not dare stand before him, except for Judas Iscariot. Now this is what makes the Gospel of Judas special. Everybody, traditionally says, I know the story of Judas and Jesus, right? Judas is the one who betrays him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is the one who gives that fatal kiss of identification, who takes the 30 pieces of silver and then hangs himself in remorse for doing so. But the Gospel of Judas tells us a very different story, that right from the beginning, Judas is part of the plan, that his actions are anticipated, and that maybe Judas doesn't even want to do the things that he's going to do, but he is doing so because it is part of the plan that Jesus has given us so that we can all return back to the pleroma once we receive this knowledge and this understanding. And so Judas is going to become the hero in this story. He is the only one of all of them who says, I understand what you are saying. I'm willing to go through with it. I'm willing to do what needs to be done. Judas said to him, I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who sent you. So, Judas, perhaps because he's an outsider himself, understands the truth Right? Judas was not really part of the gang. He comes in later. Many people disliked him, distrusted him, so he was an outsider to the group. While all the others worshiped the fallen eon, Jesus has come from the eon of Barbello to offer the truth. And so only Judas is going to be the one to transcend, not these other disciples, not the others who are, who Jesus was laughing at the beginning because they're worshiping the wrong deity. They don't understand, even though they claim to have such knowledge and such connection. The fact is that Judas is the one who is going to transcend, not them. The others will fail. But Judas is helping Jesus, and he will help others through this act to come to the divine. So he is part of the plan. Why are you thinking in your hearts about the strong and the holy generation? Truly, say to you, no one born of this eon will see that generation, and no host of angels of the stars will rule over that generation, and no person of mortal birth can associate with it, because that generation does not come from something which has become something else. The generation of people amongst you is from the generation of humanity. Power, which something, the other powers, something by which you rule. So again, some people look at this and they say, mean Jesus, why are you chastising us? But what's really being said is that no one who is born of this fallen eon will be anything great. No one who embraces itself to that fallen eon will become anything of matter. They won't be fit to rule or to govern. They won't be fit to be followed or to be trusted. But when a person receives Gnosis, they transcend beyond this generation, and they're no longer from it. Those are the ones who will come to rule. The people who are fit to govern and to bring the masses are the ones who have knowledge. Again, think of our old friend Plato in the Republic. He laid out the idea that the vast majority of people are not willing to put forth the effort that's necessary to gain true knowledge and understanding. They buy into the illusions of the world. They don't understand the truth that lies behind the forms. And so only those elect few who make it through this 40 some odd years of education that he has planned out for them are going to be in a position where they are fit to rule. Fortunately, in this particular instance, it doesn't take a long series of education because education isn't going to get you there. It comes through the transmission of knowledge, something that has to be received from someone who already possesses it and given to you directly into the mind, into the understanding. And so again, it's not so much about learning as it is about experiencing and receiving that resurrection, like we talked about in the Gospel of Philip. So that person that receives Gnosis is the one who is going to be fit to lead or guide the masses, just like those who make it to the gold class of people for Plato are the ones who are fit to become the philosopher king or queen, the one who can rule and govern and protect and guide the lower orders. And that's what we have here. Those who understand the truth, those are the ones who are fit to take on a position of authority and to help others to find their way to this true freedom, this true liberation. No person of mortal birth is worthy to enter the house you have seen, for that place is reserved for the holy. So Judas has seen the truth. He has seen the pleroma, but no mortal person, no one born of Yahweh is going to enter it. Only that person that's been transformed, right? So just like Socrates is able to see into the realm of being, and know it. Even though he's stuck in this material changing world, he understands and has direct access to that truth. He becomes the daemon, the intermediary between those two. We've talked about that many times. Well, the same thing here. Judas is one who has seen into that other realm. He knows the truth. He's experienced it. And so he knows that the material world is illusion. And something has to be done to elevate the fallen to the higher order. So a mortal person, somebody born of this realm, somebody who experiences only this world, they're not going to be able to escape. But a person who has been transformed, that person will. Again, think back to our earlier discussions on Mary Magdalene, someone who has been transformed by Gnosis, who has gone from being female to being male, from being mortal to being divine. And it is knowledge, it's Gnosis that gives that divinity. Jesus answered and said, "You will become the 13th, and you will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them." So Judas's fate is being foretold in this. From the day that he acts until the end of time, Judas is going to be cursed and hated as the betrayer of Jesus, because the people will not understand what really took place. And so he has to be willing, in accepting this assignment, to take on that burden of being the one that is hated and despised for all generations. But of all those people who saw this generation, Judas was actually the best of the bunch. He was the one who received the truth. He is the one who will rule over everyone from the pleroma above. And so we have this interesting transformation then that's taken place. Judas is seen by almost the entire world as this horrible, evil betrayer, someone who sold out Christ for 30 pieces of silver. But yet, according to the Gnosis, according to the truth that we are being revealed to us here, the fact is that, yes, Judas knew that this was coming. He knew that this is the way he would be perceived by the ignorant masses. But he also understood that he was fulfilling the role that was put for him to help bring others to this knowledge, and that he will be one of those who rules from on high, because he was part of that true generation, the one who really understood the truth, the higher order. This idea is one that's, even before the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, has been around. Bob Dylan, in his song "With God on Our Side," raises that question towards the end of it: did Judas Iscariot have God on his side? And based upon that, Andrew Lloyd Webber created the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. And that was also playing with the idea that maybe there was more to Judas, that maybe he wasn't the bad guy. And so this idea has been around for a while, that maybe Judas was an individual who was of greater significance, someone who wasn't just the betrayer. Maybe he was part of the grand plan. And the fact is, simply without Judas doing what he did, the resurrection would not have taken place. There would have been no crucifixion. There would have been no resurrection. There would have been no salvation without the actions of Judas Iscariot. And so it does make sense that this individual was part of the plan. And here it's telling us that, yes, he knows this. He knows that he is part of the plan. And he's willing to follow through with it, despite the way he is going to be perceived throughout the rest of his life. Later, we see Jesus again, who is laughing. We get the image of the laughing Jesus once more. And Judas says, "Master, why are you laughing at us?" And Jesus answered and said, "I am not laughing at you, but at the error of the stars, because these 6 stars wander about with the 5 combatants, and they all will be destroyed, along with the creatures. So all things of this mortal realm who act so pious, so holy, they're illusory nothings, things that will fade and no longer be remembered. The whole mortal world is going to come to an end as if it never existed. But the pleroma is going to carry on forever. Receive Gnosis. Become part of the pleroma. Right? If you think about it, eternity, the idea of the eternal, if it is this fullness, this completeness, then it begins to shrink in a sense as other things are brought into existence. The material world, the temporal realm is brought into being. But when that temporal realm dies, because everything that is born is going to die, right? Plato tells us that in the Timaeus. Common sense tells us that. But Plato is going to remind us of this. And so everything that's born is going to die. So what happens when that temporal realm simply disappears? And the only thing left is the eternal. Well, there's no division, there's no separation, there's no distinction within the eternal. So it's as if the original part of eternity and this new part of eternity have molded back together again, and everything that came in between didn't exist. So why are we putting so much emphasis and worry upon this material realm? This is something that we're trying to transcend, something we're trying to move beyond. It's not something that we should be concerning ourselves too greatly with. So the whole world is going to come to an end as if it had never existed. But the pleroma will always be there. It's always been, it always will be. And so why should we, if we want that eternal life, not do what is necessary to become part of that pleroma so that we can have that eternal life too, within our true realm, within our true place? And all it takes is for us to open up and receive Gnosis. But you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Very interesting line. You will exceed all of them, speaking to Judas, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Judas will aid in the liberation by sacrificing the human body that traps the divine. The sacrifice of the fleshy body that clothes the true spirit, the true self of Jesus. That's what this implies, right? So Judas is going to fulfill that role, whereby he will sacrifice the fleshy part. He will sacrifice the human aspect of Jesus, leading to his destruction, in order to elevate him to what he truly is. And as we come to the end of this gospel, it concludes in this way. They approached Judas and said to him, "What are you doing here? You are Jesus' disciple." Judas answered them as they wished, and he received some money and handed it over to them. So Judas, at this point, we see at the very end of the gospel, he is doing as we're told in the biblical gospels. He is taking the 30 pieces of silver. He is handing Jesus over, basically pointing out to them through that kiss. And as I mentioned before, the idea of a kiss in Gnosticism is a metaphor for the transmission of knowledge. And so while it appears to the people of the material realm who are caught up in the illusion, while it certainly appears to the Romans that this is a betrayal kiss, that this is a kiss of death in the mafia sense, the fact is that it is not. It is actually a transmission of knowledge saying to Judas, yes, I know what must be done. Or saying to Jesus, rather, yes, I know what must be done, and I am fulfilling it. I am putting forward my duty to you. And so Jesus is kissed on the cheek by Judas. This is the identifying mark. The Romans are able to come to capture him, to take him away for eventual execution. And Christianity carries on in the way that we've understood it. But the problem, again, according to the Sethian tradition at least, is that we've not understood it correctly. We've understood it in a naive sort of way, and we've not seen the real purpose. Again, the real purpose is to bring us this knowledge, this Gnosis, so that we can transcend beyond the world that we're living in and to move on to something higher, to something greater, to get back to our true nature as eternal beings, as part of the pleroma. Judas had a very important role in fulfilling that. Without him, this could not have happened. And so Judas is transformed from the traditional role we see him in as villain to being the hero of the story, the one for whom the resurrection, the salvation, and the elevation of mankind could not take place without his participation. And so I guess Bob Dylan finally has his answer. Judas Iscariot did have God on his side. He had to. All right. Well, this will conclude our look at Gnosticism directly. And I want to thank you for sticking with me over the past 10 episodes. Hopefully you have learned a lot from it, and we'll go out and do some reading and explore Gnosticism on your own. There are a lot of interesting books out there. Of course, I've mentioned that I am in the process of writing one, so hopefully you'll pick that up when it's available. But also simply picking up the Nag Hammadi library and reading through it. Looking at the Gospel of Judas is a very nice little text I was looking at here. I'll show you from earlier. The Gospel of Judas that was put out by the National Geographic Society. The works of Elaine Pagels are very good. Bart Ehrman talks about it a little bit. His works are pretty good. Richard Smoley wrote a book, very interesting one, called Forbidden Faith, The Gnostic Legacy from the Gospels to the Da Vinci Code. So that's a very interesting piece. So there's a lot of really interesting information. There's a lot more to explore in Gnosticism. But I hope that in this 10-part series that you guys have come to gain a little bit more understanding of Gnosticism and have appreciated what is here. So I will sign off for now, and thank you all for watching.